In 1969, a Viet Cong squad leader named Bao ordered his men into a tree line he had used as cover a dozen times before. He was certain the trunks around them would stop anything the Americans could bring to bear. He watched two of his men die anyway, through wood that should have saved them. He had learned over years of fighting exactly what American weapons could and could not do to a man hidden behind a tree. Rifle fire, even from a machine gun, lost most of its force punching through solid trunks, especially the thicker growth his side favored for exactly this reason. Artillery and airstrikes were terrifying in the open, but a man pressed low against a substantial tree in a properly chosen position had real odds of surviving even a close call. This was not superstition. It was hard-won, repeatedly tested knowledge, the foundation of how his side had used jungle cover to survive against a materially superior enemy for years. That knowledge failed him completely the moment the boat opened fire. It came from the river, a patrol craft his scouts had spotted too late to avoid, mounting a single heavy machine gun that did not sound like anything his men had grown used to. The rounds it fired did not lose themselves in the wood the way rifle fire did. They went through the trunks his men were sheltering behind, as though the trees were barely there at all. Two men who had done everything right, who had chosen good cover by every standard Bao's side had learned to trust, went down anyway, killed by a weapon that had simply erased the one advantage they believed they still held. Bao pulled the rest of his squad back that night, shaken in a way that ordinary combat rarely left him. He had faced artillery, he had faced airstrikes. He had never faced a weapon that made a tree trunk feel like nothing at all. Bao's men had a name for that gun by the end of the week, spoken with the particular dread reserved for a threat that broke a rule everyone had trusted completely. Bao could not know the official designation of the weapon that had done this, a machine gun built more than 50 years earlier for an entirely different war, still doing exactly what it had always done. He knew only that the jungle itself, the one advantage his side could always rely on, had just stopped protecting his men. That is the story of the gun that made cover into a lie. Now let me show you exactly how it did it. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe. Help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why a single machine gun broke a rule that had held for the entire war up to that point, you first have to understand exactly what made this particular weapon so different from everything Bao's side had learned to survive. To understand what tore through Bao's tree line that day, you have to understand that the weapon responsible for it was not new or experimental or built specifically for this war at all. It was older than nearly every man who fired it, a design that had already survived one world war before the Vietnamese jungle ever tested it. The weapon was the M2, a heavy machine gun designed by the American firearms engineer John Browning near the end of the First World War, chambered for a massive cartridge developed specifically to solve a problem no smaller round could handle. American commanders in that earlier war had identified a real gap in their arsenal. Nothing available could reliably threaten the armored vehicles and aircraft beginning to appear on the battlefield. Browning's answer was to take a design he already understood intimately and scale it up dramatically, producing a round and a weapon built around raw, overwhelming power rather than refinement or subtlety. The result outlived every war it was built to fight, remaining in continuous service for decades afterward, carried by American forces into nearly every major conflict the country fought for the rest of the century. Picture the actual scale of that endurance, because it is easy to state as a fact and hard to fully appreciate. a weapon designed for trench warfare against biplanes, and the earliest tanks was, half a century later, still riding on the decks of river patrol boats in Southeast Asian jungle, essentially unchanged in its fundamentals. Sons carried the same weapon their fathers had carried, sometimes the very same design lineage passed down through generations of American conflict, a continuity almost no other piece of military equipment could claim. By the time this weapon reached Vietnam, it was, in the truest sense, an old soldier, refined only slightly since its original design, proven across generations of combat that had already tested and confirmed exactly what it could do. This was not a weapon anyone needed to worry about failing or malfunctioning under pressure. It was a known, trusted quantity, air-cooled, belt-fed, mechanically simple in the way that only the best refined designs eventually become, reliable specifically because 5 decades of hard use had already found and fixed whatever weaknesses an earlier version might have carried. What made this weapon so devastating in Vietnam was not any new technology at all. It was the simple, brutal physics of the round it fired. A cartridge built decades earlier to punch through armor, plate, and aircraft, skin, now being pointed at jungle terrain that had never once been designed to stop anything remotely that powerful. The tree that had reliably stopped rifle fire and had given real, tested protection against lighter machine guns had never been tested against a round built originally to defeat steel. Now understand, specifically and honestly, why this weapon defeated cover that had reliably protected Bao's men against nearly everything else, because the answer is a matter of simple, measurable physics. Rather than anything mysterious, the round this weapon fired carried enormous kinetic energy delivered by a cartridge originally engineered to penetrate armor plate on vehicles and aircraft. Independent testing of the round's penetration capability has demonstrated its ability to defeat nearly an inch of hardened steel plate at real combat distances, a benchmark that puts the destructive potential against organic material like wood into proper perspective. A tree trunk, however substantial it looked to the eye, presented dramatically less resistance to this round than steel plate did, and a round capable of punching through armor simply did not slow down meaningfully when it encountered wood instead. This is the specific detail that broke Bao's understanding of cover completely. Rifle rounds and even standard machine gun rounds lost significant energy and often deformed or fragmented when striking substantial timber, which meant a man positioned behind a sufficiently thick trunk had real, tested protection against those weapons. This heavier round did not behave the same way. It retained enough of its original energy and shape passing through wood that a man on the far side of what looked like solid, reliable cover received nearly the same lethal impact he would have taken standing fully exposed in the open. Picture the actual physical sequence of what happened to Bao's position, because it clarifies exactly why the danger was so total. The round strikes the near side of the trunk, and instead of flattening and losing most of its energy the way a rifle round would, it continues through, splintering wood ahead of it in a straight, brutal line. On the far side, where a man believed himself protected, the round emerges, still carrying enough force to kill exactly as it would have in the open. There was no partial protection, no reduced severity of wound to reward a man for choosing cover at all. The tree simply failed completely at the one job it had always reliably performed before. Think about what this meant for the specific tactical judgment every squad leader on Bao's side had to make patrol after patrol for the rest of the war. Choosing cover had always involved a calculation, refined through hard experience, about what kind of position offered real protection against what kind of threat. That calculation now had to account for a weapon capable of quietly erasing an entire category of protection that had worked reliably against everything else, and the men making that calculation often had no way to know, in the moment, whether the threat approaching them carried this particular gun or something more conventional. Understanding why Bao's men encountered this weapon in this specific setting requires understanding the range of platforms this single, versatile design was mounted on throughout the war, because its presence was far broader than any one battlefield role. Riverine patrol craft, operating on the extensive network of rivers and canals that cross much of the country, mounted this weapon prominently, giving American naval forces genuine firepower against ambushes and fortified positions along waterways that had once offered Viet Cong forces relatively safe corridors of movement and concealment. A patrol boat carrying this weapon could bring devastating fire to bear against a tree line or a riverbank position in a matter of seconds, converting what might once have been a relatively low-risk ambush position into a genuinely dangerous place to be caught. The same weapon appeared in equally significant numbers mounted on helicopters as a door gun, giving crew chiefs and gunners a weapon capable of suppressing ground positions with a level of penetrating power that lighter door-mounted weapons could not match. It appeared on armored personnel carriers, giving mechanized infantry a genuinely serious direct-fire weapon that could support an advance or defend a position with real, sustained lethality. It rode atop tanks on the pintle mounts of countless trucks and jeeps, at fixed defensive positions ringing American bases, a single, versatile design, essentially unchanged in its fundamentals since its original conception, adapted to nearly every platform the American war effort actually used. Picture the sheer variety of first encounters this created across Bao's side, because no two units necessarily learned this lesson the same way. One squad might learn it from a river gunboat, exactly as Bao's had. Another might learn it from a door gunner during a helicopter assault, watching cover that should have sheltered them fail in the same terrible way. A third might encounter it mounted on an armored column pushing through terrain that had once offered safe concealment. Each unit arrived at the same hard lesson from a different direction, at a different time, with no coordinated warning passed between them until word of the pattern had spread widely enough for anyone to name it. This ubiquity mattered enormously to how Bao's side experienced the threat. There was no single, easily identified source to watch for and avoid, the way an ambush team might learn to recognize and steer clear of one specific unit or one specific piece of equipment. Learning to fear one specific gunship or one specific type of convoy escort was a manageable problem. Learning that this particular threat could emerge from almost any direction, mounted on almost any kind of American equipment, was a much harder problem to plan around. It would be incomplete, and it would flatten an important part of this story to present this weapon as an unstoppable, unanswerable threat. Because the honest history includes real limitations that shaped exactly when and how dangerous it actually was. The weapon's effectiveness depended heavily on line of sight and reasonably direct fire, which meant terrain that broke sight lines completely, dense enough vegetation, sufficient elevation change, genuine three-dimensional cover, rather than a single tree line standing in open ground, could still deny it a clean shot even though individual trees no longer offered reliable protection on their own. Bao's side adapted, over time, by favoring exactly this kind of denser, more complex terrain over the simpler treeline positions that had once seemed adequate, accepting the loss of one kind of cover by leaning more heavily on another kind the weapon could not so easily defeat. Picture what this adaptation actually looked like in practice, months after Bao's own hard lesson. Units began choosing routes deliberately away from rivers and open approach lanes, accepting slower, more difficult movement through denser terrain in exchange for avoiding exactly the kind of exposed tree line that had once seemed like adequate protection. This was not a full solution. It was a hedge, built on painful experience, that traded one set of risks for another, more manageable one. The weapon was also heavy, relatively slow firing compared to some contemporary designs, and dependent on a platform to carry and stabilize it effectively, which meant it was rarely, if ever, something an individual soldier carried and employed the way a rifle or a lighter machine gun could be employed. This meant Bao's side, while it could not defend against the weapon's raw penetrating power directly, could sometimes avoid the platforms that carried it, choosing routes and positions that stayed clear of the rivers, roads, and open approach lanes where boats, vehicles, and low-flying helicopters typically operated. And it is worth being honest about the specific danger this weapon posed to the crews operating it as well, because that danger was real and it balanced the story in an important way. A weapon mounted on a riverine boat, a helicopter, or an exposed vehicle position made that platform and the men crewing it a priority target for exactly the reasons we have discussed elsewhere in this series regarding priority targeting of powerful weapons and the men who operated them. Crews manning this weapon in exposed positions absorbed real, serious casualties throughout the war, a cost paid in exchange for the devastating capability the weapon provided. The specific dread this weapon produced, once you understand its actual mechanism, reveals something important about the deepest kind of fear a soldier can experience in combat, distinct from the fear of firepower alone. Bao's men had built their entire tactical confidence around a hard-won, carefully tested body of knowledge about what kept them alive. Years of combat had taught them which positions offered real protection and which did not, and that knowledge, refined through genuine trial and genuine loss, had become one of their most valuable assets against a materially superior enemy. This weapon did not simply threaten them with more firepower than they had faced before. It quietly, invisibly invalidated a piece of that hard-won knowledge, teaching them that a category of position they had trusted completely could fail without any warning at all. This is a different and, in some ways, more corrosive kind of fear than simple firepower produces. A soldier can adjust his behavior around a threat he understands completely, calibrating his caution to match the danger accurately. A soldier who has just learned that his own understanding of danger was wrong in a way that had already cost real lives before the lesson was learned carries a different and more persistent kind of uncertainty into every subsequent decision. Bao's men did not simply fear this weapon's power. They feared, in a deeper and more unsettling way, the possibility that other pieces of their hard-won tactical knowledge might turn out to be equally unreliable. And this fear, once established, spread beyond the specific situations where the weapon actually appeared. Word of what had happened to Bao's squad traveled through other units the way any lesson about a broken assumption travels, and men who had never personally faced this particular weapon began treating treeline cover with a new and different kind of caution, aware that the protection they were counting on might, this time, turn out to be exactly the kind of illusion that had cost other men their lives. The weapon's psychological reach extended considerably further than its actual physical range, because the lesson it taught was portable in a way the weapon itself was not. Bao survived the war, and in the years afterward, he thought often about that afternoon in the tree line, and about what it had actually taught him regarding the limits of even the most carefully tested knowledge. He came to understand that his failure that day had not been a failure of judgment in any ordinary sense. He had chosen his position exactly the way years of hard experience had taught him to choose it, applying knowledge that had kept his men alive through countless engagements against countless other threats. What had defeated him was not a mistake in his own thinking, but the arrival of a specific weapon whose capability simply exceeded the boundaries his prior experience had established, a category of danger his knowledge had never needed to account for until the moment it suddenly, catastrophically did. He thought, too, about how his sight eventually adapted to this new reality and about the particular humility that adaptation required. He had spent years building genuine expertise about jungle warfare, and that expertise had been real and valuable. Encountering this weapon's actual capability forced him to hold two things simultaneously that did not sit easily together: continued confidence in the vast majority of what his experience had taught him, alongside a permanent, hard-won awareness that even carefully tested knowledge could have gaps large enough to kill men who trusted it completely. He remembered, years later, teaching a younger squad leader the specific lesson that afternoon had cost him so much to learn. He described the tree line, the boat, the two men who had done everything correctly and died anyway. He watched the younger man absorb the lesson the way he himself once had. Slowly, with the particular discomfort of realizing that even the most trusted knowledge could carry hidden gaps. He did not want the young man to distrust everything he had been taught. He wanted him to hold his knowledge a little less absolutely than Bao once had, and he hoped, without any real way to know, that the lesson might spare this next generation at least a portion of what it had cost his own. And he came, eventually, to a complicated respect for the weapon itself, separate from the fear it had once produced. It was not a clever or sophisticated design built for some cunning tactical purpose specific to this war. It was simply an old, brutally effective piece of engineering, built decades earlier to solve an entirely different problem, still doing exactly what its original designers had built it to do against an enemy and a terrain nobody involved in its original design could ever have anticipated. Here is what Bao finally understood about the gun that tore through the tree line his men had trusted, and why it mattered more than any single afternoon of loss. Every soldier who survives long enough in any war builds a body of practical knowledge about what actually keeps him alive, tested and refined through hard experience until it becomes something close to instinct. That knowledge is genuinely valuable, and it genuinely works against the range of threats it has actually been tested against. What it cannot do, no matter how thoroughly tested, is account for a threat outside the range of that testing, a weapon or a circumstance that simply exceeds the boundaries the knowledge was built to handle. Bao's understanding of cover was not wrong. It was incomplete in a way that only became visible the moment a weapon capable of exposing that incompleteness actually arrived. That is the real meaning behind the fear this weapon produced, and it reaches well beyond one tree line and one squad. The most dangerous gaps in any hard-won body of knowledge are not the gaps you know about, the ones you can plan around and account for in advance. They are the gaps you do not know exist, the assumptions so thoroughly tested and so reliably confirmed that you stop even thinking of them as assumptions at all, treating them instead as simple, settled fact. Bao trusted a tree trunk the way any experienced soldier trusts a piece of knowledge that has never once failed him before. And the moment that trust proved unfounded, it cost him something he could never fully get back, even after he understood exactly why it had happened. The weapon that did this to him was not new or secret or built with any particular cunning aimed at his specific circumstances. It was old, simple, and brutally effective, doing precisely what it had always done against a target that had simply never needed to worry about it before. Bao's men gave it a name within the week, spoken with the particular dread reserved for a threat that had broken a rule they had trusted with their lives. That is what the .50 caliber gun that tore through tree lines actually was, not a clever new weapon built to defeat them specifically. simply an old, honest piece of overwhelming power, finally pointed at the one thing they had always assumed would keep them safe. Now you know why they feared it more than almost anything else in that war. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, brutal moments when trusted knowledge failed on both sides of that long war. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you're watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a gunner, a boat crewman, a door gunner, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.